Welcome to the 5th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. Today, we are so honored to have joining us John Heubusch. John is the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. I want to, before I even get into his introduction, I want to remind all of you watching, joining us by Zoom, to submit your questions, whether in the Zoom chat below, or if you're joining us live on Facebook, go ahead and just enter a question in there on the in the comment section. So John is something of a Renaissance man. He, in more ways than one, I might add, and he can fill you in a little bit about that. His career spans philanthropy, business, government, and he was Chief Operating Officer of Avalon Capital. He was the Chief Administrative Officer of Gateway. He was the Executive Director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee back in Bush 41, in which we both served, I as a presidential speechwriter. He was Chief of Staff to Elizabeth Dole when she was Labor Secretary, and also served Elizabeth Dole when she was at the Red Cross. He is also author of two very fast-paced, high-stakes thrillers, which I highly recommend, The Shroud Conspiracy and The Second Coming. So everybody who's joining us, welcome. And most of all, thank you, John, and welcome.
No, absolutely great to be here with you, Jennifer. It's a fine day out here at the Reagan Library in California, and nice to see all of you.
Well, I miss that. I miss that so much, and I know a lot of people watching also do. I'm very proud to be a member at the library, and to have access to all of the spectacular programming they have there. But, you know, for people that just go to the library, they might not quite understand really the enormous operation that the foundation encompasses, including the new institute. And I was saddened to hear about some of the damage that occurred there. But if you wouldn't mind, just, you know, particularly for people at the Atlas Society, telling us a little bit about about everything that you do there.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to, Jennifer. The Reagan Library is the product of something called the Reagan Foundation, which President Reagan started actually back in the late 1980s, just before he left the White House. The foundation supports the Presidential Reagan Library, and we're headquartered here at the Reagan, and it's a 400-acre campus, the largest and most visited of all the presidential libraries. About 500,000 people come through our doors each year, and we do an enormous and widely varying set of programs, from scholarships for seniors heading off to college in President Reagan's name, to one of the best public speaking series in the United States, and presidential debates, and in a 260,000 square foot museum dedicated to President Reagan and his lifetime of extraordinary public service, and special exhibits on display here that rotate through the library each year, making it a real cultural attraction and a destination location in California. You know, we're up there with you know, the huge museums and theme parks that are in Los Angeles, and quite a visited place. And thank goodness, because the mission of this place and all that we do is all about you know, passing on to the next generation of individualistic heroes like Ronald Reagan, the lessons learned and the ideals and the vision of our 40th president, one of the most admired presidents in the nation. So we do many, many things, and people pulse in and out of here. It's an ideas place. And we also have a sister organization. It's our Reagan Institute, which opened a few years ago in Washington, D.C., and it's essentially serves as Reagan Library East now. We're proud of what we do, and we're proud to represent an extraordinary man in history and what he stood for. So that's really the essence of what we do, Jennifer.
That's spectacular, and I want to remind everybody, get your questions in. You also have wonderful conferences too, and the Out Society was really thrilled to be able to participate in one of the conferences that you had for cultivating leadership for the next generation. And I was also really impressed that it did sort of span the ideological, spectrum. It was a real opportunity, unlike some conferences, where kids are grouped around one idea set, which is also good for them to be able to find community, but to be able to interact with young people that were from all different kinds of backgrounds. And, there's one program that is near and dear to the heart of one of our trustees, Peter Kopsis, whose family helped to sponsor the educational module that you guys have, the Reaganomics 101. Could you tell us a little bit about that, how we could access it, and what stage it's in?
Yeah, happy to, Jennifer. We have 60,000 school kids from 5th grade all the way up through college that come through the Reagan Library at one time or another during a year, and to take part in a wide variety of programs. And as you said, Jennifer, a number of them all about leadership and how young people today can, in the mold of Ronald Reagan, become great leaders themselves. We also have a curriculum that's online, that's shared with teachers and students across the nation. So whether it be a course that a junior or senior in high school might take during the summer in the way of a leadership program, or whether it be right here in our Discovery Center that I'm sitting in today, where we have 25,000 students per year come through on role play in Oval offices like the one I'm sitting in now. Scholarships, we are all about education, and what your terrific trustee, Peter Kopsis, was able to do is support our education efforts in essentially creating a Reaganomics 101 course for students, essentially high school through college in particular. We got together with Peter because we were very like-minded with respect to the ridiculous situation the country finds itself in from the standpoint of almost 1/2 of our youth in this day and age believing there's any value to socialism. I mean, it's the absolute opposite of what President Reagan stood for. And so we felt in working with Peter, putting together a program where kids, especially of high school age, could get a much firmer grasp on economics and how the free market system works, how capitalism works versus how socialism doesn't work. President Reagan was at the forefront of intellectual thought when it came to economic thinking and the freedom of the individual and the value of a small, not a large government, and how taxes and regulatory burden, can create a real mess for our country. So we're all about creating curriculum that teaches those very concepts, and it's being integrated into all of the youth leadership education programs that we do. And we're right now, I'd say, about midway through completing development of all this material that will be brought to tens and tens of thousands of students across the nation. So we're really excited about launching into the effort. This virus, like everything else, has slowed us down from the standpoint of students aren't able to come to the Reagan Library at the present time. but we certainly look forward to welcoming them once again when we reopen, and also providing these kinds of materials online as well.
Well, and speaking of the virus, and President Reagan obviously presided and was a leader when there were other crises, that his administration had to deal with. But as somebody who probably knows Ronald Reagan best, how do you think that he would have responded, and would he have done anything different in terms of whether it's the pandemic, the huge economic losses that have resulted from these shutdowns, and then also just the racial unrest that we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, the country's torn apart at the moment. There's no doubt about that. And President Reagan was anything, he was a uniter. So, it's Jennifer, it's when you try to overlay a man in his time in the 1980s on top of present day, who knows? That's somewhat of a guesstimate as to exactly what President Reagan might have done. But having worked on Capitol Hill and worked in Washington in various jobs, a key difference that I see between President Trump, who certainly tried his level best, it seems to me, to get America back to work and to protect our nation. What I have seen is some of the great strengths that President Trump has is he operates in many respects off of his instincts, which can be really solid sometimes. President Reagan certainly had good instincts, but I'd say, he operated with an extremely set of extremely talented people around him, and there was a much more disciplined process for decision making when enormous crises like this would erupt. And so I'd say stylistically, you won't find two individuals more disalike between President Trump and President Reagan. And I think that holds true not only in how they communicate, but also how they think and how they might act during a crisis. President Reagan in the modern day, I think he'd be just as great a president as he was in the 1980s. And, he would have used his power as an extraordinary communicator to try to, heal the wounds that have been caused during these last couple of crises. And, I'm certain he would have performed quite well, but it's a little difficult to say exactly, what he might have done. I know right now what he would do if he were still with us is he'd get his library back open. We are presently closed, and we won't be reopening until the federal government gives us the say-so. So I think he'd probably give a phone call to Washington to get them to allow us to reopen our doors, because we're certainly ready to.
That's a really great point. Yeah, I also think it's not a reflection on current leadership, but that a couple of President Reagan's strengths was he had this incredible benevolence. He had this warmth and also this just optimism. That was really kind of built in as part of his character, and so the ability to project that and to invite other people into feeling optimistic and providing reasons to be optimistic. I think that was very unique. And so, another figure, another also transformative figure, not a politician or an actor, although she did have quite an overlap in terms of her interest in cinema and film and her experience in Hollywood, is Ayn Rand. And our organization is devoted to kind of promoting the ideas of Ayn Rand to new audiences in fresh ways. Your organization is all about also preserving and promoting the ideas that Ronald Reagan cherished and held dear. And one of the things that was similar to them, Ayn Rand was a fierce, anti-communist, And that was in part, born because she lived, in a communist country. She grew up, she saw the Bolshevik revolution before her eyes when she was 12. So she came here and she was really hell-bent, but she'd actually seen it up close. And yet, Ronald Reagan brought this at the same passion and his warnings about communism were, for a lot of people at the time, they were just, whoa, this is where's, you're gonna set off another world war or something. What was it, whether it was personal experience or the things that he read, where did his foundation in knowing that this was really, just an evil empire, where did that come from for him?
You're right. President Reagan, when he was an actor in Hollywood and was president of the Screen Actors Guild, at the time there was a really serious intrusion of, communist sympathizers and, literally communist thugs that Ronald Reagan stood up against, and it was a very difficult experience in his life. He was under a real threat because of all that he did to try to rid the Screen Actors Guild and essentially Hollywood from some really terrible things that if the communists were able to take control would have wrought upon his union and all that he was doing. So I think the beginning of his real concern for what communism meant was when he saw it up close and personal in the business he was in. And from that moment forward, he made it a lifelong passion, a lifelong commitment to try to rid the world of communism. And, if looking back on Ronald Reagan 100 years from now, there's many accomplishments that I'm sure historians will point to, but there probably will be no greater accomplishment that they speak to about Reagan than, he helped to set tens and tens of millions of people in the formerly captive nations free from communism. And he spent an extraordinary amount of time as president staring down the evil empire and calling it what it was. And you're right, he created a lot of waves at the time, and people thought that he might be driving animosity and potential war with the Soviet Union, but what he was actually doing behind the scenes with Pope John Paul, with Margaret Thatcher, with others, was laying the foundation for the eventual crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism. And I just know, he's up there right now. If there's anything he's proudly looking down on is that, he did a great deal to set the individual free. And I think it's his greatest accomplishment, bar none.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about his experience in Hollywood and having seen that because, of course, also Ayn Rand, having been in Hollywood, having gotten her start, like in a seamstress department, and then just even as an immigrant with that not being her first language, starting to read and write scripts, and then later testifying about the communist infiltration that she saw and she experienced, and there's so much blowback at the time, but I'm sure their paths must have crossed. And so, speaking of one great novelist, Ayn Rand, who was a novelist. I gotta say, I remember, I don't remember where it was that we were, but when I found out that you had just written this book, that I was like, this is one of the busiest people I know, and you had so much going on. I mean, tell us about how many people you must have to manage, and including just legions and legions of volunteers. Well, that is extraordinary in and of itself. But what drove you to write your novels? What gave you the ideas, and how long did it take you to do? And tell us a little bit about that, because it's just fascinating. And they're on Audible, which everyone should know. They're great. The reads are great.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, Jennifer. The two novels, The Shroud Conspiracy, it's my first novel, and the Second Coming is the sequel to that. They both became Amazon bestsellers for several weeks, and I guess surprisingly to me, did quite well. And I'm in the middle of writing the third. I'm like any number of other writers. We have written speeches for senators and congressmen and presidents, and have written everything from technical manuals to poetry and everything in between. But I never thought for a moment that I had the ability to write a long form piece, to have the stamina and the patience to stick it out and create a plot. And so I just kind of set it as a challenge to myself. I sat down and wrote the first page of the first chapter one night, and 6 months later, after doing that just about every night, I had myself a novel. But I never thought anyone but my kids or my wife might read it. And it got sent to an agent, and within a week, bang, it was out there, and Simon and Schuster picked it up, in both novels, and they both did real well. And so I'm happily surprised that I have been able to put pen to paper and in that format, and it's really fun to do. I've decided I want to keep right on doing it, and I've got offers to do that. So I guess it's going to be part of my future. It's just writing can be really fun and really agonizing, and as long as you have more fun than agony, I think you keep right on writing.
It definitely is, it can be a very lonely, very grueling process. So did you tell just a little synopsis or a little teaser about the plot, and did you, or the concept, and did you have the plot already figured out? I mean, because it is a thriller, right? So it is a mystery. Did you kind of know where you were going, or did it just kind of come to you as you were doing it? I know there's two schools.
Yeah, the novels are all about, they center on a plot involving the famous Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And you can imagine the kind of the good versus evil, and is the shroud real or is it fake? And it's the most famous and most important and revered religious relic in the history of mankind. So the plot that circles around it, takes on a lot of dimensions. I came up with the idea, when I was a kid at 17. I was, in senior year in high school, and I was in a religion class that had a documentary about the Shroud. And I just thought it was so fascinating at the time. I said, in watching this film, was I staring at the actual face of Christ our Lord? And I just thought it was remarkable that there'd be a relic on this earth that made that possible. And I always thought it was such a fascinating thing that it might make for a great book or a great movie. But it was 45 years later, that I actually got around to taking that kernel of an idea when I was 17 and putting it into 400 pages. And fortunately, I guess I got lucky and wrote it well enough that people liked it. So, but it's a great, it's a wonderful story. It really is. It's all about someone that started out as an atheist, an anthropologist, and it challenged his thinking, throughout both novels as to, faith and the concept of miracles, and a lot of things that are really important to all of us. So a great time to write it, and I'll keep right on doing it, I think.
Well, it's very interesting to me, because our organization is about philosophy, and we're about objectivism, which is sort of a reality-based, metaphysically, it's not supernatural, and that we know things by through our senses, through reason. So, but that said, I wrote early on my op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, "Can You Love God?" and Ayn Rand. just, even just as objectivists, I think it is interesting to go through the process of looking at something which has a different kind of metaphysics, and having that kind of dialogue, and also just on the larger sense, like coming together, like about the things that we agree with, like socialism and the importance of fighting it on moral grounds. Speaking of fighting, John, you fought also on a personal level. I don't know how much you feel comfortable sharing, but I've admired a lot of things about you. One of which is how you have just persevered, against personal challenges. And I wanted to just see how you're doing, and what that experience of being a survivor and overcoming those challenges, how it might provide hope, strength, and experience to others.
Yeah, I don't mind sharing that part of my story, because if I know I'm not alone, there's others out there that have had similar or more difficult struggles. But I got a very rare form of cancer, and the moment it was discovered, I was told, that's it, you've got 5 or 6 months to live. It actually was in the middle of writing those novels that I learned this. I have to, what saved me? I don't know. Part faith, part science. I went through some, experimental procedures and experimental drugs, and it took 5 years to knock it out. So it was, a difficult struggle throughout, but I had so many reasons to live that I just never gave up. And we might hear about that or see it in the movies, and people just say, get in there and fight. And everyone has their own way of facing struggles like that. I don't know that I've got some secret formula. I just, I've got a beautiful family and the will to live. And that combination of things is really what I think helped to save me. And sure, it gives one a different perspective on life when you go through struggles like that. But I'm just one of many, many people that have faced hardships like that. And I'm, one of those that was fortunate enough to survive.
I think it goes back to that theme we were discussing earlier, like about hope, and the importance of maintaining hope, whenever there's a possibility that, even if however small it might be. And, a hope, whether it's for a miracle or about something else that, a new discovery that comes along down the road. So I think that having hope and having the confidence that you can overcome the challenges that life, in front of you. I think that was probably a reminder from your staff that we need to wrap this up pretty quickly, because I know you're a busy man. You probably have something else to go to. But why don't we have a few questions from the audience. I'll get to one, which I think is interesting during these very partisan but divided and yet confused and yet disrupted. We have a president, he's a Republican, Democrat, Republican, what? Who knows? And now with everything that's going on, it is sort of one of these massive shocks to the system where people may reevaluate, well, are the choices I'm making and my party affiliation, is it the right thing for me? The question was about President Reagan, about, his kind of political development. He was a Republican president, but he had been a Democrat before, right? And he had kind of changed his party affiliation.
Yeah, he started off as a Roosevelt Democrat, and Ronald Reagan, to his last days, was a conservative and a conservative Republican, but he was an American first. And of course, his victories in winning for the Republican Party were important to him. But he was a John Wayne type. This is a man who went through life with confidence and optimism, and he might disagree with another on the left or in the Democrat side that were trying to fight against his principles, but at the end of the day, he knew we were all Americans and we might have differing opinions on, what's the best path forward. But, he liked to end the day as friends, even with his enemies. And, he was just absolutely famous for that. So, at the end, he was just a man with a big heart and plenty of optimistic confidence that the nation could, always have brighter days ahead. And he acted that way in office. I mean, genuinely felt that way. What you saw is what you got. And that's a marvelous, form of leadership. It's the kind of thing that people want to get behind and people want to follow, a unifier like that. So, labels like Republican and Democrat, yeah, they were important in the great scheme of things in order to ascend to the White House and all that. But at the end of the day, he wanted to help Americans of all stripes. And I think history has really, been kind to Ronald Reagan as it should be, because he might have, in his time, been quite controversial, but now he's looked on. Gallup does a survey every year, and he's always named as one of the top 3 most admired presidents, and I think he will be for a very long time.
One more question that just came in. Where in today's, because like you say, it's things have changed, things have shifted. Where would Reagan find himself on the political spectrum today? I mean, I think he would definitely be a Republican, and he would have popular appeal, but I'm not sure he would be considered a populist per se. I mean, he definitely had very firm principles. He believed in free trade, lower taxes. I mean, that, so what would you say to that particular question that somebody sent you?
He, no doubt, I'd definitely be considered to this day a conservative, a fiscal conservative. For me, what I find that is remarkably different in today's times versus the time President Reagan was in the White House is I think he would feel that Republicans have lost their way on the size of government and federal spending and the national debt. And, Reagan, the only budgets that, really grew during Reagan's time were the defense budget for, obvious reasons, the need to stare down the Soviets through a peace through strength program. But in this day and age, it just seems like there's not a spending program that even a Republican dislikes. People are, in Washington rarely seem to be concerned about economic principles, the size of the deficit, and it's going to come back to haunt this nation. And I think President Reagan would be very, very concerned about his own party and the lack of attention that it's paying to the size of government. As everyone in your organization would know, the larger the government, the more the individuals crowded out. And this would concern President Reagan to no end. And I think that's where the Republican Party needs to refine itself. If it's, otherwise it's going to be in some real trouble someday.
That is absolutely, it's absolutely true. This is just not make-believe money. It does come from someplace, and this spending, all bills must eventually come due. And objectivism, our ethics, don't sacrifice yourself to others, but don't sacrifice others to yourself. And spending money of other people, of grandchildren, of great-grandchildren, of future generations, just seems to me like one of the ultimate forms of sacrifice. So, well, thank you, John. Thank you so much. Thank you for the extra time. I apologize to all the people that we couldn't get to your questions. Had some little technical difficulties, but I really appreciate that. I love the spirit that you brought to this space, and particularly that idea that Ronald Reagan always, even with people that he were political adversaries with whom he passionately disagreed, always wanted to leave space at the end of the day for people to come back and to be friends and to reconsider. So that was beautiful. I wish you the best, John. I hope to get to see you sooner rather than later in person. And thank you for partnering with the Apple Society, and thank you for all that you do.
Great to be with you, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.
You too.